Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our panel. I'm happy to welcome you from wherever you're logging into, whether it's morning where you are or afternoon like it is here in Canada on the East Coast. I'm located in Halifax, Nova Scotia, which sticks out in the Atlantic Ocean. And it's 2:00 here, so welcome. So the title of our panel today is called Artificial Intelligence, ChatGPT, and Academic Integrity. What are the implications for higher education? And this is presented by the Faculty of Open Learning and Career Development here at Dalhousie University. My name is Brian Hodson. I'm the Senior Manager of Program Impact and Evaluation in the faculty. And before we get along, I would like to introduce our Dean Hyers, who will bring welcome from Dalhousie and from the faculty.
Thanks, Brian. So welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us this afternoon as we explore the fascinating, intriguing, and very much unknown questions around artificial intelligence and ChatGPT and really how these are going to impact higher education. I was in a meeting yesterday and we were talking about ChatGPT, sorry, as I know many people are right across the world. And we were honing in on the fact that, you know, as an institution of higher education, we really do have an obligation to look at new technologies, new approaches that are coming down the pipeline and that are emerging and really tackle the hard questions around them. How do they impact what we do? And how do we help our students navigate this new world? Because, you know, ChatGPT really does introduce new elements and very many unknown elements. So I'm very much looking forward to the panel discussion we've got. So a huge thank you to our panelists and our organizers for bringing us together to discuss these really challenging issues and help us find ways to navigate through them with our students. So thanks very much for coming. And I will also just do the land acknowledgement for us. So Dalhousie University, where the webinar is coming from, is located in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq. We are all treaty people. We also recognize that African Nova Scotians are a distinct people whose histories, legacies, and contributions have enriched that part of Mi'kma'ki known as Nova Scotia for over 400 years. So thank you very much, everyone. Welcome, and I'll pass you over to our panelists and our moderator. Oh, you're on mute there, Brian.
Of course I am.
Someone was going to do it. It may as well be you.
I'm glad it was me. I just want to state from the outset that I am not a bot. Or am I? This is the questions we're going to be talking about today, because this seems to be the way that things are going, or at least the perception of the way things are going, this concept of ChatGPT and AI as well. Just want to let you know off the top here that you'll be able to access the recording of the panel tomorrow. If you have registered for the panel, and you have, if you're here, you'll receive a link with the recording probably tomorrow. So if you have to leave early, don't worry, the link will be sent to you. I just want to also let you know that about today's, the way the panel will go today. So each of the panelists, who I'll introduce in a moment, will have 10 minutes to do a presentation. And then after that, we'll have about a 20-minute discussion. And then following that, we'll have about 20 minutes for a Q&A. So if you have their questions, go along. As you go along, please put them in the chat. Our moderator, Mary Eleanor, will be taking those questions and having them and putting them at the end. And I'd also like to just say thank you to Jennifer McDonald, whose idea this was originally to do this panel. So thanks to Jennifer for this and all her work as well. So first of all, I just want to introduce our panelists. We have an excellent group of people here. The first I'd like to introduce is Christian Blouin, who is a professor and associate dean academic in the Faculty of Computer Science here at Dal. I keep saying here at Dal, so because I'm in Halifax. That also we have Sarah Elian Eaton, who is not in Halifax. She is an associate professor at the Workland School of Education at the University of Calgary. And welcome to you, Sarah. Bob Mann is the manager of discipline and appeals, the university secretariat here at Dalhousie. And then Aisha Mustak is the associate director of English language studies in the Faculty of Open Learning and Career Development at Dalhousie. So we will go, that's not the order in which, that's alphabetical. That's not the order in which we're going to be presenting today. So just, and one second here, here's the list of everyone here. So the first person who's going to speak today is Aisha, and you can see the her title of her talk here. I will pass it over to you, Aisha. And again, as you have questions, please feel free to do that in the chat and in the Q&A function as well. Thank you, Aisha. Over to you.
Thank you. Happy to get this started. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today as we, as Diane mentioned, looking at the intriguing and fascinating world of generative AI. I'm going to share my slide in a minute, so give me a second here. Okay. Is everyone able to see my slide?
Yes.
Yeah,
okay,
we can
great.
see it.
All right, so let's get started with generative AI, the emergence of ChatGPT. So I'm basically going to talk about, like everyone, I was intrigued with what this new technology is, what it's going to do, and what it means for language educators as well. So I'm hoping some of our audiences are language educators or who work very closely with language sciences. So let's take a look at what happened back in November 2022. ChatGPT has been making all kinds of waves since its launch, and there have been mixed reviews on how people feel about it. There's quite a fervor of, oh, it's a lifesaver, it's an efficient tool with significant uses in academia and businesses, in all spheres of life as well. But there have always been headlines around some hesitations as well. Some people are viewing it as the end of everything. Oh, we are not going to think anymore. It's the end of critical thinking. It's a shortcut to success. And people have also been raising questions on the ethics around using generative AI, especially the use of ChatGPT. So that got me really interested in, okay, what does that mean for me as an educator and as a language educator in my classroom and for my students? So in looking at what is happening with ChatGPT, I'm trying to explore what generative AI is. Just a second, my screen refuses to move. Okay, there you go. All right, so mixed reviews. Some are like, yes, embracing ChatGPT. Some are like, no, some are maybes. And just within the span of me preparing for the panel, I have seen reactions. Some countries are banning AI. So there's all kind of mixed reviews happening there. So what is generative AI is a question that I had, like, what's going on? So generative AI refers to artificial intelligence systems that are trained on generating original content. And that content could be of various nature. It could be text, it could be images, audios, and doesn't need a lot of explicit instructions to generate that original content. How original it is, it's kind of a question that goes into the cusp of ethical considerations as well. But is generative AI something new? That's a question that, you know, you probably have all been asking, and the answer is no, not really. So some examples of generative AI that you might have, you know, had experience with is chatbots in customer services or Alexa. So these are all generative AI as well. So it does have different forms of generating content. So some is text, like ChatGPT or Perplexity, but also music. You can create brand new music using certain generative AI for example, Magenta. You can also make new games using generative AI of game software. Same with images. So Dall-E became very popular a few months ago, Deep Dream as well. And then also you can generate videos like Synthesia and Pictory. So that's really interesting to see that the technology has existed for some time, but they're just innovations in the way we use it, in the way it kind of interacts with the customers as well. So if you haven't used ChatGPT or if you haven't been on the platform, I highly encourage you to take a look at it. It's fascinating. It's really interesting. So here's an example of how ChatGPT works. So you write a prompt. So I gave them a prompt. Write a paragraph on Canadian Arctic sovereignty and provide references and citations. And it has done a really decent job. I'm not going to read the whole paragraph, but it starts off really well. Canadian Arctic sovereignty has been a significant topic of concern for Canadian governments in recent years. And then goes on to explain some of those significant topics that it talks about in the first paragraph. It also gives me references. So what this example tells me is that ChatGPT responds to prompts and questions, is able to produce grammatically correct responses, and has a fairly academic formal register as well. But as I played along with ChatGPT, I found some really interesting things happening as well. So I changed my prompt and I said, write a paragraph on Canadian Arctic sovereignty in the style of a 3-year-old. I wanted to see what's going on. And also for language educators, you might be thinking graded learners as well. So what grade a learner is in their language proficiency. So it did a pretty decent job. I was impressed. So I'm not going to read again the whole thing, but Canada wants to be in charge of the land and water in the big cold place called the Arctic. And I think that's pretty impressive for a 3-year-old and very impressive for ChatGPT. But what it tells us is that it also has the ability to respond to specific requests, but also specific nuances. And I think that's super interesting. But as an educator, I wanted to explore more, and I gave ChatGPT another challenge. And I asked, can you write a paragraph on Arctic sovereignty in the style of Shakespeare? And oh my God, within 30 seconds, it just spews that amazing sonnet right here. So it says the Arctic sovereignty as a subject most profound, where nations vie for control and treasures can be found. Canada, Denmark, Norway, Russia, and the United States, each with the Arctic territories and each their own fates. I think that's amazing. And also just thinking about this, I'm like, I'm taking this to my classroom and having my students unpack this poem in a writing class. And I think that will be a great activity to do. So, but what it tells us is that it also has the ability to produce genre-specific writing. So very impressive, very smart. And moving on, let's take a look at the implications of what language classroom capabilities ChatGPT has. So here's a list. It's not very exhaustive. It can have conversations, create outlines, respond to questions within a text. It can simplify or expand a text for you. It can also do drafting, summarizing, paraphrasing. It can answer complex assignment questions. It can also do literature reviews, literature analysis, help you prepare presentations, editing, vocabulary, and grammar. Like I mentioned, not a very exhaustive list, but something that for language educators, they're like, yeah, there's so many ways I can use this, but in so many ways, it limits my students' ability to produce their own work. So I thought about, how does ChatGPT actually work? How is it generating this amazing text? So in very brief layman terms, I'm going to try and explain how text generation works in generative AI. So let's take, for example, this sentence, the police chased and if I asked you to fill in the sentence, you might go, the robber or the thief or the suspect. And that is a likely answer. Hardly we will get a response that says the police chased the house. That's just not possible. And that's what we know. That's what our knowledge and experiences are. Similar to that, AI generative softwares are trained on a massive amount of data that has all these possible likely completions. So if I put this in ChatGPT or any other generative AI software, the likely responses are suspect, and that's how it completes the sentence. Or the thief, and that's how it would complete that sentence. The police chased the thief. Some unlikely responses would be the police chased the clown. The possibility is always there, but very less likely to be a correct response, or the Jabberwocky, for example. So what is happening here with generative AI text softwares is that they're trained on finding regularities and patterns by trying to complete sentences. So where do they find these regularities and patterns is they're trained on massive data sets that already exist. And I will talk about that in a minute in the next slide. So this is how it generates the most likely response. The police chased the suspect. And so it's finding these regularities, and that's how it completes a sentence. But then it goes a step further because ChatGPT is trained on analyzing context as well. So it can create another sentence. The police chased the suspect, which was running down the street, something like this. It keeps on feeding itself from the data that has been provided to it. And similar to completing a sentence, it can generate paragraphs and it can generate essays as well. So it depends on the, I guess, the amount of data that it is fed on how diverse its responses are going to be. So just looking a bit further, how does it really work? So it uses artificial intelligence to generate language in response to input. And this is very complicated computer science phenomena, but it uses a natural language processing technique, which involves a corpus collection. So the first step to creating something like ChatGPT or generative AI is to have a lot of data. And that data has to be diverse. So it looks at all kinds of books, articles, blogs, websites, media, all kinds of text that exist so that there is a variety and it can answer our complex questions. For example, write like a 3-year-old or write in a Shakespearean style. So it does need that corpus there. And then that data is kind of pre-processed for training. Pre-processed would mean maybe removing some of the duplications or kind of removing anomalies that might not make it easy for machine learning. And then there's this phase of training and evaluation of that corpus or the data that was collected. And that would involve training it to how to answer questions, how to do translations, how to do customer service, quick Q&A, things like that. Once it has been trained, it gets deployed into various softwares like ChatGPT or Perplexity or other AI softwares. And it also needs continuous improvement. That's like a very layman explanation of how softwares like ChatGPT work. But there's this one step further with ChatGPT. Knowledge of words is not enough. There has to be awareness of word order and context. That's extremely important to make sense. And ChatGPT excels at that. It really analyzes the context to keep conversations going, provides feedback, and often corrects itself if it makes a mistake as well. So the idea is to have a large language model. The whole corpus that it's trained on turns into a large language model, which provides foundations for such tools to work. So as an educator, when I see ChatGPT producing really great answers to questions, assignments, I'm like, wait, what is going on? But on further thought, on investigating a little bit more and just taking a pause and not having a reaction, I think about these softwares as they have existed over time. So for example, digital translation AI softwares have existed, homework softwares have existed as well. And instructors, educators have always navigated around these and supported students in how to use these softwares and how to incorporate them in our teaching and learning, and how we can help students understand the importance of living with these softwares, like coexistence. We can't really ban them or shun them. They're here to stay. So we have to make some changes to the way we teach, changes to our pedagogy, perhaps, changes to the way we do assignments and assessments. So just moving forward, I'm going to go back to that example of the first paragraph that it wrote. And as an educator, I'm looking at it from a lens on where I can support my students in understanding how ChatGPT might not be the most accurate tool for assignments and assessments. So seemingly, it's a great paragraph, grammatically accurate and cohesive, but not necessarily coherent, something that we would teach in class, something that our students would be able to do in further investigation of the topic of Arctic sovereignty. And as ChatGPT produces larger text, it gets robotic and repetitive, and very unlike human speech. And also, although the idea generation is there, it lacks the expansion of an idea. So you see that there's just a few thoughts and ideas in that paragraph. They're not really expanded on into a nice, well-written paragraph. Further, most of the citations here actually are citations are not provided for sure, but references are all made up, so they're inaccurate. And ChatGPT kind of gives that disclaimer as well, that most of the information is accurate, but there can be occasions where information is not factual, information is inaccurate, information is biased. So there are some shortcomings to that software as well. So what does that mean for the language learner and the language classroom? I think the idea, again, is very much to embrace generative AI and provide guidelines and sort of policies to our students that help them make the best of new technology that is coming up, which is the future for our students as well. So one of the things is a negotiated syllabus and the use of artificial intelligence, perhaps having a conversation, an open conversation with students. I know in our English for academic purposes classes here at Dalhousie University, when we looked at generative AI translators, we had our students our instructors help them understand what those translators are, when to use them, how to use them, and why not to use them. And I think a similar system can be applied with a software like ChatGPT, where we negotiate that syllabus with our students as well. And also being very clear with guidelines that we have for them. The other thing is talking about cognitive offloading tools and their impact on language learning. So sometimes you have to look at what the idea behind writing a paragraph is. If we want to cognitively offload some of that burden students have, we can ask them to use softwares like this, and it can help them focus on more metacognitive learning processes, looking at language, looking at register. So there's quite a lot of ways in which we can help our students integrate software like this in the class as well. So translators, digital dictionaries, ChatGPT, all of these can help as cognitive offloading tools in the classroom to focus on something else. The other thing to reconsider is learning outcomes, perhaps for assessments, and incorporating AI text tools. So perhaps looking at kind of divide and conquer. So maybe ChatGPT is writing the outline, but the student is writing the essay or the report, or vice versa. And it can happen on quite a lot of ways. And people can get really, I guess, creative with this. One of the things is having ChatGPT write something, but then grading it, critiquing it, asking it if this is actually how the report should be written or the assignment should be conducted, or gamifying it, bringing a Shakespearean sonnet on Arctic sovereignty and then turning it into a paper. I think that's a really good, engaging activity for learners to do. Another thing we can look at is increasing in-class practice time, especially with language. And I do want to draw here from the universal design of learning on multiple means of engagement, expression, and representation in using, so ChatGPT is just text, But language learning is so much more than that. There's conversations, there's listening, there's speaking, there's reading. So looking at how we can incorporate all of those elements in the classroom. My end word would be to have more practice in class and less assignments so that things are low stake and students are engaging in conversation. So that brings me to the end of my part. Over to you, Bob.
I guess it's me. Thank you, Aisha. So I will try sharing my screen. Let's see. Oh, hold on. Oh, it's not letting me share. Aisha, would you mind just sharing your screen again and zipping through my? Thank you.
Absolutely.
I hate to. Yeah, my system settings are not, and mine are fairly straightforward. While Aisha is sharing her screen again, I will just reintroduce myself as the manager of discipline and appeals for Dalhousie University. If anyone listening in who doesn't know me thinks that manager of discipline and appeals is kind of a edgy and somewhat sexy job title for a person to have, it is. I'm responsible for overseeing Dal's sort of judicial functions with regards to academic integrity, as well as some code of student conduct things, professional suitability. I've been doing this for about 13, going on 14 years. I've seen a lot of different things over the recent years. And so I've had an opportunity to see how a lot of the academic offenses and issues that students bring to the table when they're seeking to take shortcuts, or when they're being negligent, or when they're in a difficult situation and making bad choices, or when they're poorly supported. All those different ingredients to the soup. I've seen how some of those things have changed, and I've seen the ways that students have made use of some different developments and some different technologies. And one of the things that I will say right off the top about this particular moment that to me sets it apart from the other moments is that this is a moment not unlike some others that we've had. The difference, one of the big differences to me, is that it has been heralded. It has been announced. We have been told, here is a thing, and people can now use it. Everybody, let's talk about this. Whereas when the phenomenon of essay mills or ghostwriters or students being able to avail themselves of other advantages began cropping up, we learned about them somewhat organically and very slowly, and they crept up on us, and there was no big conversation about them until we were knee deep into it. So this is a unique moment for my part. Now, I want to say a little bit about, maybe just go back one slide there, Aisha. I just wanted to say that one of the most frequent questions that I've been asked over the last little while, and I've done a number of media interviews and things like that, what is Dalhousie's policy? What is Dalhousie's policy on ChatGPT or on this software in particular? I'm very quick to point to the policies and procedures that we have, which are fairly straightforward. We have an intellectual honesty part of our calendar, which has a number of pieces to it. But if you step back from it, it stands for the proposition that students must submit work that is their own. And to a certain extent, we can't get a lot more detailed on that because we have disciplines and faculties and departments, sometimes right down to the course level, where the context of that course is so specific that it wouldn't make a whole lot of sense to make a university-wide statement about what is an offense, what is not an offense, what are the standards, what are not the standards. We largely leave that to the contextually specific issues in a faculty, a program, or again, right down to the individual course. So that is Dalhousie's position on the standards and expectations. There are some broad statements, and as you get down to a program or faculty level, there are some more specific statements, but that has largely been our approach, and that is somewhat unchanged. Then we have discipline procedures that exist at the faculty level, where if an instructor has an allegation or a suspicion that something has been done, that someone has tried to gain an unearned advantage or they've been negligent, there's an integrity officer in that faculty they can go to. There can be a conversation, there can be an investigation, and there's a process by which students are given notice and called in, and they have a conversation about what has happened. And we try to make that educational, but of course, sometimes it does get punitive. And we have the Senate Discipline Committee that deals with students who, issues that can't be resolved at the faculty level, or things that are so serious that only our discipline committee can deal with those situations. So all that rubric, that system largely remains unchanged. Maybe I'll skip to the next slide there, Aisha. So going back to what I was saying before, one of the things I've observed already, and we're still very much in early days, is that the challenges we face when it comes to these kinds of cases involving, let's again use this shorthand as AI, even though I think there's some better expressions to describe it. The challenge is largely evidentiary, but it's actually not new. We're facing questions here that are not all that different from a judicial perspective, from the perspective of someone trying to investigate or figure out if someone has committed plagiarism or passed in work that is not their own. Not all that different than what we've been dealing with for a number of years with ghostwriting or with contract cheating, having unauthorized assistance or materials. Ever since COVID, we've been dealing with situations where we've had software that has been detecting students writing exams online or doing quizzes online, accessing unauthorized materials, having browsers or tabs open that they're not supposed to. This is all relatively new territory, but it's relatively new. It's not brand new. We've been doing this for a few years now. And then, of course, for quite a long time now, we've been dealing with situations where students have been genuinely, in a good faith way, however negligently or naively, seeking help from editors, from tutors, from other kinds of supports that raises their work beyond the level, or lowers it, I suppose, to a point where it's not their own anymore, or it can't be considered their own anymore. And that has been the subject of some debate for some time now, going back a number of years. All of these issues and considerations are at play in this new context involving this software. As I say here on this slide, our discipline and adjudication process are flexible enough to deal with these. And the reason that they are is because we're looking for some of the same things that we've been looking for a number of years now. And I'll skip to the next slide there, Aisha, thank you. So what are the things we're going to be looking for? Context of the exercise. What was asked? What were the expectations? What is the writing style? What is the quality of the work? Are there any other unusual markers, shifts in font, anything that kind of stands out or as a red flag that kind of makes you think, maybe this person did not write this paper? That stuff's been around for a while. We've been dealing with that for a bit. And then, of course, we have the technological verification, which is what people seem to be largely concerned about. But I will say this, we've had originality checking software for quite some time now, Turnitin, some other large brand names. They've never been perfect. And what we have found in our experience is that those tools help as evidence, they help as indicators, but they're not determinative. We don't use those reports as proof positive. They simply get added to the list of other considerations where a decision maker looks at it and they think about it and they hear arguments about it and they give the student an opportunity to explain. And they say, okay, well, on the balance of probabilities, it appears to me that it's less likely that this is your own work than it is from some other source. That exercise is largely unchanged. And I think you will hear some of our other panelists talk about the fact that we perhaps overuse the capital and the time that we have looking at the evidentiary or the judicial side of things, and we should be more working at the pedagogical side of things. And one thing that I will say before I pass it on to our next speaker is that one of the things I've learned over many years now, having worked with decision makers on these cases and having seen the kinds of situations that are brought to us that we have to deal with, the less engaged and the less personally invested a student is with the work they're doing or the program they're doing, the higher the likelihood they are going to seek shortcuts. The more you have someone simply trying to tick off a checklist of deliverables and not feeling invested in the coursework or the discipline or wanting to learn, the more likely they are to seek shortcuts. If they don't have personal relationships or if there is no sense of community within the program or within an individual class, which is very difficult to do these days in large classes and large institutions, the more likely you're going to have someone not feeling a connection to the work and just wanting to get it done. There are a lot of high-level considerations in those things, but I do think that this presents us with an opportunity to have a much deeper conversation about what are the purposes of the things we're asking people to learn, and how are we engaging with them? Because frankly, if you bought a membership to a gym and paid lots of money for it, presumably you want to improve your health and you want to get stronger and you want to be more resilient, whatever your goals are. It would be kind of silly to have access to a shortcut that makes it appear that you've done that work when you actually haven't, if the result is that you're no healthier, you're not feeling better, and you've not achieved any of the goals you wanted to through going to that gym. If we can start thinking about education in that way and engaging with students on that front and really trying to understand where people are and why they're at university and why they're taking our programs and spending so much money on tuition, we might get closer to understanding a much better way to circumvent one's willingness or desire to use these tools than in relying on the adjudicative or investigative process to combat it, even though that's an important piece of it. So those are my bits. I'm happy to pass that along to the next speaker.
And I believe the next speaker is me. So I think I'll try to share my screen. So Aisha, if you want, so I can actually use my little cursor thingy. There you go. Okay. So I'm assuming that everyone can see my screen at this time. So my name is Christian Blouin. I'm Associate Dean Academic in the Faculty of Computer Science. I've been doing that for about 7 years. I have been an academic integrity officer within the Dalhousie framework for a little shy of 10 years. I've sat through hours and hours and hours of academic integrity meeting, written lots of decisions. And this is a topic that's near and dear to our heart in computer science, and just making sure that people who graduates are healthier and more muscular, and they haven't used a machine to lift the weight for them, as Bob's metaphor so effectively state. The point that I want to make today as a panelist is I think it's helpful for people to understand a little bit of what is happening inside of the black box that are large language models and in the various transformer models. So what I thought that I could talk about lots of lenses and dimensions as an academic leader, but because I come from computer science, I think it's appropriate to kind of just give a very high level appreciation of what these models are doing, because I think once you have a sense of what's going on underneath, you'll be better prepared in the future to understand the next disruption. And that next disruption is going to happen very soon, and it's probably not going to look the way that we imagine it. So I've put a link here on that slide. It's actually a brilliant lay explanation of how these models are working. I am borrowing 2 diagrams from that site, JLMR. I recommend, if you have 30 minutes while making supper, to watch this. It's at a level that requires a certain level of attention, but it's not going into mathematics or any of the technical detail. So don't be intimidated, even though it may feel a little bit over your head the first time. What I want to kind of, the point that I want to drive here is that what these models are doing is essentially performing a task, which is to take a bunch of tokens. And these tokens can be words, can be parts of words, can be pixels, can be sequence of actions. In this case, because we talk about ChatGPT or GPT-4, we're really thinking of what comes in is a sequence of parts of words. Like in that case here, what we see is the input is je suis étudiant, which is not even grammatically correct in French, but and then it comes out at the other end as I am student. So the way it works, and I think a metaphor that breaks down very quickly, but is helpful in understanding what happened, is you can imagine each of these words is really annotated as a number. And there's 50,000 of these possible numbers. So as we enter a prompt in a system like this, it gets turned into a bunch of number. And from that point onward, it does not matter what the words were. It's just number that are feeding through a system. Each of these words or numbers are connected to a large number of little nodes. And so imagine instead of number, we're talking about water. So water is flowing up into the encoder, and then they converge into a layer. And then something happened in that node, and that node pushes another number. And this other number is feeding another layer, and so on and so forth. And so how the connections are made is exactly what training a large language model is by showing tons and tons of data to fine tweak such that by the time the sentence that was the input gets to the top of the stack, what it's encoding is in a very abstract way, a concept or an idea. It's no longer a language, it's really in the realms of ideas. And that metaphor is not too far off from how our brains and that are made of neurons are actually encoding thoughts, concepts, and emotions, and so on from sensory input. That's the artificial intelligence part of the metaphor. So you could imagine you enter a prompt, it feeds through all of these layers. At the end, these layers are such that it encodes an idea and a context. And when it's properly trained, if you change the order of two words in the input and it changed the meaning, then you would expect that that top layer will have different shape. But if you're expressing the same thought using different word, if it's properly trained, you expect that at the top layer, it's going to encode the same idea and the same context. So it's going from language to contextual context. Now, what these systems are doing then is starting with a prompt, you want to have some kind of text produced at the other end. The top layer of the encoder is fed to the bottom layer of the decoder. And this concept percolates all the way up and back. But the goal of the decoder is not to go from word to concept, it's go from concept to words. So the concept percolates from the bottom all the way up, and the idea is kind of fed multiple times into the decoder. Again, through a very complex mathematical process, it is possible to make all of these connections work a certain way that if you enter a prompt asking for a particular output, or for asking for an output that is related, it will come out at the other end as an output. Now, the beautiful thing with this is, in the case of Midjourney or DALL-E, you have an input as text. You just type a prompt, give me a picture of Bob Man holding a banana or something like that. But instead, it's lunchtime or snack time. But in the case of DALL-E or Midjourney, instead of outputting words like ChatGPT would do, it outputs a sequence of pixels, and these pixels form an image. So the reason why when we type a prompt into ChatGPT and we say, write an article or write a paragraph about Arctic sovereignty, it encodes the concept of Arctic sovereignty at the very top in its full contextual context. And the more you have training data, the better is going to be the understanding of the nuance of that context. And then it feeds from concept back into an output and writes something that may be longer and that will actually be responding to the query in the first place. There's no magic. Now, to give you an idea, the number of parameter that needs to be optimized, like if you think of all little tubes of water going up like this, is in the order of tens or millions or hundreds of millions or even billions. So these systems, it's not that we could not imagine them in the past, it's just that we didn't have the computational capacity to do it. We didn't have the ability to gather enough data to train these systems in the first place. That's really the main difference. But the idea, the notion of transformer is quite new. The papers are fairly recent. The full understanding of their property is not, because it's not by design. The way they perform their task is really sort of a stochastic process, and we just optimize until they give a result that makes sense. And then we say, well, the system is trained. So it's not, we don't have the ability to analytically assess these boxes. That's what makes ChatGPT different from a calculator or from a grammatical check, where for a given input, you can assert a particular output. It makes them very unpredictable, but because they're unpredictable, they make the output look a lot like what humans do. And that brings us to what is inherently being human. And I would argue that we define what is inherent to a human by a process of exclusion. As soon as we create a tool that can reproduce what we thought only human can do, we're like, well, okay, no, that's all right. We can manufacture in large quantity, or we can transmit information using airwaves and instead of speaking. So what is happening right now is we have a rapid contraction of what we thought, or what we still think is perfectly unique to a human's cognitive ability. My reaction when I use ChatGPT is, first of all, I never sound that peppy in the first place. So it's never really my voice. It's just generic text. But that it surprises us that it gives such lifelike output is because we are essentially performing that with our own brain in the first place. These systems are really good at pattern matching, and going from the pattern of a prompt to the pattern of an output, it gives provides a behavior that's very human-like. That little diagram here, I'm showing it, is part of the process of processing an input. So you have all these tokens. The animal didn't cross the street. One important step early on in the process is, all right, so there's an it in this sentence. What is this it refers to? These are all known natural language processing tasks. And somehow through the training process, all of these little problems are getting solved. The larger the model, the better is the solution, the more general is the knowledge. But that leaves us to one item. We are in higher education, we have a particular mission as educator in higher education. And so the top, oops, I didn't mean to do that. The top part of this slide is actually drawn from a mind map that colleagues in computer science have collaboratively built on trying to figure out what to do. Because if you're impressed by chatbots and LLMs to generate text, you should know that these systems are even better programmers than they are natural language writers. That they actually can produce decent codes that does fairly well in computer science exams or quiz or assignment. So I think we need to move as quickly as we can away from talking about academic integrity and asking ourselves the question, what are we doing in higher education? Ultimately, our goal is we want to graduate individuals that are capable of critically assessing change, guiding societal directions, and leverage the edge of knowledge. That's what we're doing. That's why people pay so much money to come into our degree. People we graduate right now will have a career between 2024 and 2040 something. They are going to be using tools like this. So we can't just tell them, you know what, pretend it doesn't exist because it's inconvenient from an education perspective for us to assess you. But that does not mean that all of a sudden we have to accept the fact that students can generate work that they cannot understand. So the question when someone comes to me and say, hey, this happened with ChatGPT in my class, the first question that I ask them is, what are you really trying to assess? Did the tool actually, are you going to give a grade to the tool? Or are you asking the right question in order to understand? Critical thinking is not writing. We use writing as a medium to assess critical thinking, for example. So there ought to be a better way to do this. It may be very inconvenient. It may be terribly impractical, and that's why we need to figure this out. And meanwhile, we have this gap between the way we instruct our students, the way we assess our students, and the fact that the technology is sort of meddling in the middle and allowing them to misrepresent what we are really trying to assess. By default, we define that as academic integrity, and fair enough, as long as we're very clear with the rules. But I would describe that students with a high level of integrity, particularly who want to push the boundaries, who wants to truly exercise at the gym, to be truly healthy and maybe be an Olympic athlete, will want to use these tools in the most legitimate manner. It's not just about misrepresentation. So my prompt when it comes to higher education is, setting aside practicality, what are we really trying to do? And how can we possibly assess students on what really matters? And so in our faculty this summer, I intend to hire a few people whose job will be to see what can you do if you're unethically or ethically using large language model into our courses? How far can you go by misrepresenting? Or how high a grade can you get without learning anything? But also, what can we possibly use these tools as an opportunity for our students to become critically assessing these tools, knowing where the boundaries are, what are the correct usage, and maybe instead of asking for a small assignment, we can ask for a large assignment because many of the components can be generated faster, which means they can spend more time thinking at a higher level of abstraction. So I see this as a pedagogical problem that has a short-term academic integrity issue. We need to sort ourselves out very quickly, in my opinion. And I think Sarah is next.
Yeah, thank you so much. This has been a wonderful group to work with. Thank you so much for the invitation to join you. I'll also start to share my screen. I'd like to start with a bit of a story. As I was reflecting on the invitation today from Mike's at Dalhousie University, it occurred to me that 30 years ago exactly, I was wrapping up a year of open studies as an open studies art student at Dalhousie University after having graduated from the other university down the street the year before. St. Mary's, where I graduated from, didn't have a program in Spanish. And I had taken my degree there in English literature, but I really became enamored with the Spanish language. And after having done a study abroad where I learned the language in Spain, came back and wanted to study it more. St. Mary's didn't have that program, but Dalhousie did. So I went and did a year of wonderful, wonderful studies at Dalhousie, where I got to learn literature and expand my language capabilities. And then I changed my course a little bit and decided that's what I wanted to do master's work in. So this time 30 years ago, I was wrapping up time at Dal, preparing to come to Calgary, where I would end up spending the rest of my career. When I got to Calgary, I was excited to become a graduate student, excited to do an MA in Hispanic literature. And before I registered in those courses, met with a couple of my professors, one of whom is a specialist in Cervantes, and we would be studying Don Quixote. I thought, oh, this is going to be fantastic. And she said, well, of course, you've read the Quixote. We won't be studying the text. We'll be studying the literary theory around the text. And my heart sank. Of course, I had not read Don Quixote, much less read it in Spanish. I didn't know it in any language. And she said, well, you'll come with your various iterations of this and we'll look at the literary theory. And I thought, oh my gosh, I'm completely in over my head. I was not prepared for master's studies in a different language. So I trundled off to the bookstore and bought a Penguin copy of Don Quixote, took it back to my room and read it over a weekend. I think it was about 900 pages or so. And then went to class completely ill-prepared to study literary theory on Don Quixote. I was ill-prepared for the whole program, but I thought I was okay because I had earned good marks at Dalhousie and at St. Mary's, and I got great reference letters to do my master's program, but that didn't prepare me for the reality of studying in a second language. Through my master's program 30 years ago, I used Google Translate a lot, and I didn't tell anybody. I did it secretly. Partly because I knew that I didn't have the language competency or proficiency to successfully complete my program without assistance, and also because it was frowned upon. It may not have been articulated as misconduct at the time, but it was, if anybody had known what I was doing, I'm sure that they would have looked down upon me at the very least. So later, I finished my master's, that was great. And then I went back to studying in my first language and I made my way over to education, where eventually my path led me to study plagiarism and academic integrity. But I never forgot this experience of being completely linguistically overwhelmed and cognitively overwhelmed. So Aisha talked about cognitive offloading. I was cognitively completely overwhelmed, at least in the first couple of years of my master's. And so I have an empathy for those who come to study in English who may not have had the language proficiency that they thought, as indicated perhaps by a standardized a proficiency test or their great reference letters or their excellent marks. Of course, I came from a language dominant culture, moving into studying in what was here a language minority. But those experiences of not being able to cope, of relying on technologies even 30 years ago to just help me get through the day of school are experiences I've never forgotten. So when I started studying plagiarism, one of the outputs of that study was a book a couple of years ago, called Plagiarism in Higher Education. And the story I just told you is one I share in the book. And the purpose for sharing that study is to differentiate between academic coping and academic cheating. So students will do whatever they need to do to cope, to get through their day in order to sincerely try and meet the academic requirements of their program. And having studied academic integrity now has become my main area. There's sort of two different schools of thought, if you will, around academic misconduct. One is a morals-based approach based around a tradition of character education and the idea that if one cheats, one is a bad person. There's another school of thought, mostly espoused by compositionists and people who work in language education, that it's academic misconduct is a behavioral issue, that citing and referencing can be taught, academic writing can be taught, paraphrasing can be taught. And that point of view is espoused especially by folks like Rebecca Moore-Howard and others who study composition and writing. I tend to identify more with the skills-based, in part due to personal behavior, but I'm also not interested in following a moral path or wagging my finger at anyone for misconduct. I don't think that's productive. We get into education because many of us, we love teaching, we want to help students, and we want them to have a great future as well. So at the end of writing this book on plagiarism in higher education, I was looking towards the future. And in May of 2021, when the manuscript was due to the publisher, I was madly rewriting the last chapter because we were starting to get hints then about the impact of artificial intelligence. And I started thinking about, I mentioned Rebecca Moore-Howard's work. She's been a great influence on my work, and she advocates for throwing out the term plagiarism. She says, get rid of it, get it out of the policies. It's not misconduct, it's a teaching issue. In fact, she has a great article called Don't Police, Just Teach. And she's really adamant that definitions of plagiarism need to be thrown out. And I started to think about, well, what does it look to go beyond throwing out definitions? I mean, realistically, they're not going to be thrown out of policies because it's really embedded as part of our academic misconduct discourse. And I thought, well, what comes after that? Or what's an alternative? And the thing that kind of came to mind was an idea of a post-plagiarism world, of what does the world look like when artificial and human writing become so hybrid that we can't tell where the human ends and where the robot, and I say robot very broadly because it's kind of a sexy term, but where artificially intelligence or machine generated writing becomes just infused in what we do. And so, thinking about these tenets of what does this world look like in a post-plagiarism world, and the great examples that were shared today showed kind of a little bit of a static output, because that's all we can put on a slide of here's a text generated by an AI app. But there's lots of apps out there where a student can go in, generate a draft, and then interact with the text to rephrase things, to do their fact checking, to put their own words in, put in synonyms. So it becomes a way of interacting with text such that the final output is neither generated by artificial intelligence and nor is it generated by a human. So if ChatGPT and other tools, because now there's thousands of tools and OpenAI is not the only company on the block, so to speak. If these tools are becoming ubiquitous, which they are, and students have access to them, which they do, and so-called output that itself is original, that's a contested term, but then we get humans interacting with that text, the output then becomes something else, neither human nor AI. And this, I think, will start to become the norm with our students, and they'll interact with these texts in a kind of similar way that folks from my generation might have interacted with Cole's Notes, or back when I was a student, Google Translate, which at the time would give me Latin American Spanish, but one of my professors was trained in Spanish from Spain. So these like linguistic regional differences were things I had to deal with and parse out as a student when I was writing. So thinking about this world in which it's become the norm, and I think some of the anecdotes we've heard today are really pointing in that direction. So that was kind of one of the key things I thought was really useful to start contemplating, and that that also there's no, in my opinion, threat to human creativity. Human creativity can be enhanced. And as humans, we don't lose our ability to imagine or inspire or create. That will remain part of what makes us human. There's a great book, and I didn't put it in the chat, but it's called Non-Computable You, Y-O-U, Non-Computable You. And it's a wonderful book to talk about the things that artificial intelligence can't do. And it really differentiates between AI outputs and human creativity. Excellent work if you get a chance to look at it. But our ability to, as humans, to create, interact, and be relational, that remains inexhaustible. When I'm talking with folks, I'm like, imagine, your favorite writer. What if instead of writing a book every 3 years, they could, through interacting with an AI, write a book every year or less? Imagine if you're a Game of Thrones fans, that George R.R. Martin could have kept up with the writing of Game of Thrones, right? We know the TV show didn't keep up with the books. Or if you're a fan of the Wheel of Time series, what if Robert Jordan had been able to finish the series himself rather than handing it over to Sanderson? Those are possibilities that we'll never know if they could exist. But for the people who are writing now, that possibility exists. So folks who write fiction and other works as part of their profession may also use these tools. And so we're thinking of this in an educational context with students, but the tools are already out there and they're being used in industry and by creators and artists of all kinds. And the next point I thought about here, it's certainly become the most contested part. And I will say that I put this infographic together fairly quickly a couple of months ago, because I had people contacting me saying, oh, this ChatGPT stuff is the worst thing for plagiarism. Plagiarism is going to be everywhere, and sort of a doom and gloom, and really catastrophizing the impact of this. And I put this on the infographic and realized that I didn't unpack it as well as I could have. When I said language barriers disappear and one's first language will begin to matter less and less as tools become available for humans to understand each other in countless languages, I didn't mean that one's first language or languages will become less important. And my own bias here as being a child who was raised on the original Star Trek and thinking about romanticizing about the possibility of a universal translator was kind of where my mind was going with that. Nevertheless, I could have unpacked that a little bit better. What I was thinking about and getting excited about here was the possibility that language barriers themselves might disappear. We already have apps on our phone, language packages we can download so that we can take a picture of a text in a foreign language. If you've traveled anywhere where you didn't speak the language, like I did last year in Turkey, then you'll know the power that those apps can bring. And the interactive nature of those is likely to increase, in my opinion. Thinking about the academic integrity side of things, a key point of all this is that we as humans can, if we wish, relinquish control or give control for the writing, either in whole or in part, to an app, the same way we could give it to another individual. At the end of that, we, the humans behind it, the students submitting the work, we still remain responsible for the output. So in terms of things such as academic integrity or plagiarism, it may be that the output is not plagiarism in any traditional sense. However, if, as Aisha and others pointed out, that the output contains confabulations, faked references, fabrications, that the human remains responsible for. The student remains responsible for ensuring their references are real, for doing their own fact checking, verifying the content of it, and so on. So the humans are still responsible for truth telling. I suspect as we look towards the future, which is kind of one of the questions that's been presented, focusing on skills such as fact checking and also prompt writing will become even more important going forward. So we often talk in the humanities about critical thinking, which can be kind of an abstract thing. That becomes really concrete when we talk about artificial intelligence, because we talk about fact checking, which is effectively critical thinking. So it's up to our students to ensure that the work that they submit is in fact factual, the references are real, etc. And that attribution and giving props, as it were, showing respect to those whom we learn from, still remains an important part of academia. So often when I talk with students about teaching, citing, and referencing, they see it as a technical or a mechanical skill. But when I say to them, well, who wrote the article? What do you know about them? Where are they from? What did they study? Those are often new questions for students, because they're not thinking about, even if they get a PDF of an article or they read a book, they're not thinking about necessarily about the person who wrote it. That's a skill that you develop when you get deeper into scholarship and you start understanding the who behind the what, if the what is an article or a textbook. As scholars, we start to think about the who. I suggest that we start to think about reversing that and always thinking about, well, who wrote it? And how do you know what their position is on things? And what have you learned from this person, as well as from this article or this chapter, and so on. So the ways we think about attribution and showing respect to others for what we've learned from them will continue to be important. And also important in a world where we continue to think about how to decolonize learning and the ways in which our current systems of citing and referencing continue to privilege Western text and Western ways of knowing. So attribution, for example, of Indigenous knowledge keepers and stories continues to be an important topic that we'll want to discuss. And then finally, to kind of wrap up here, as I was digging deep and thinking about plagiarism, I suspect that historical plagiarism definitions might no longer apply. I mean, Rebecca Moore Howard might get her wish when she said, throw out the definitions of plagiarism. And that call was to the academy, but it may end up being also to the society, because if AI ends up generating something original, I suspect people will start to cut and paste less and less. Why would you cut and paste when you can generate something that's custom? So I suspect that policies can and will adapt over time. The jury's still out on that. In terms of academic policies right now, I can tell you, just to build on what Bob was talking about, we're looking at things like unauthorized assistance, unauthorized content generation, those kinds of things. So we do have mechanisms in our policies. We're also talking about the ways that students can make their learning explicit. And again, the jury's out on, do we cite ChatGPT and other AI language models? Do we write it in the acknowledgements? And there's kind of a raging debate if you're on social media about those very things. But the idea of giving attribution in some way so as to make one's learning process visible, I think remains an underlying and important piece of it all. So I'll close there and I'll hand things back to our host because I think we have lots of questions and conversation in the chat here.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you to Christiane, Aisha, and Bob for very enlightening and excellent points. There's a lot, obviously, here and a very broad range of things to talk about, to think about, from everything from how the tool works and how it affects language learners, how it affects academic integrity, and so on. So now I want to move into our Q&A. We have 4 experts here on this tool, and so this is your opportunity to pick some brains here and get some questions in. So our moderator of the chat has been feeding me questions along the way, and so I've been collecting those. If you have some questions you'd like to ask, please put them into the chat or put them into the Q&A tool, and we will move through them. So the first question that I want to put out, and maybe I'll put this one to Aisha first. The question is, how do we guide students to detect what is real and what isn't? And maybe anyone else can pop into that, but I know that Aisha, you're already working with students on this. What's your feeling on this?
Okay, that's an interesting question. And it has been an ongoing conversation here in our department as well. And something that our instructors refer to as the spidey sense. So I think one of the things that we have to look at is, and going back to what Christian and Sarah has been saying, is the purpose of that activity. What do we want our students to do? What is the outcome? What's the learning that is happening there? So if the learning is, and then based on that, we see how we use these tools. So if a student is, for example, here in our English for academic purposes classes, we don't have high stake end of the term exams. We have formative assessment. So we actually walk our students through the process of writing. So, and it starts with topic selection. That's actually a small percentage of an assignment to be able to come up with an idea that you want to explore in your writing class, and then have the outlining phase, and then have a draft phase. On that, they receive feedback. They go back and forth with their instructor on how to navigate through that complexity of writing and engaging in that critical thought and coming to a conclusion in their writing process, and then writing a final draft. And in all that process, and I think what the question here is asking is, how do we detect kind of if it's a real work by the student or not? I feel it's how engaged the teacher is in that whole process with the student. So are you able to understand your student and their needs, and how are you focusing and reaching out to them? It's kind of like meeting them where they are. And going back to Christian's point that students hardly ever want to cheat unless there are circumstances that are forcing them, like an act of desperation. So it's not the idea of the software itself, but the idea of what's causing that desperation. Maybe you've given us a 10,000 word a thesis to write and only 3 months to write it in. And that's not there has to be changes in the way you look at the amount of work students have, how much cognitive load they're taking, and their ability to be able to get that done in a manageable way. So coming back to the question, how do we detect? I think getting to know the student, becoming familiar with their writing styles, and also talking about in the classroom can be really helpful, and keeping the spidey sense up. So I think that's important too. But again, the idea is not gotcha. The idea is, how can I help support you moving forward with this? Yes, Christian, over to you.
Well, I guess it depends how we define reality, right? Is reality text that was written with knuckles, or is reality what the text says is actually accurate, correct, and up to date. And I think from a university perspective, we should care much more about is what's written current and acknowledging the edge of knowledge and important works and by here acknowledging important works includes other ways of knowing and communicating the information. So writ large, that's the critical piece. To me, that's reality. If a chatbot generates the document, what we really should assess the student on is, was the work accurate? Were you capable of producing something that is containing truth or a point that arguably is consistent with a thesis? And much less so whether it's, fingers that generated the keystrokes or the keystroke were generated by a machine.
So I'll throw this up because Sarah just her throat, giving her throat a chance to rest. Bob, I'll throw this over to you. What do you think about this, all this aspect of it?
Yeah, I mean, just just in terms of trying to help students understand what's real and what's not, or I mean, my angle is the adjudicative piece of it. I mean, I think that I have certainly seen some situations where a student is very challenged by being asked to do a particular task that really doesn't require knowing what's true and what's not. And in fact, I can sound a bit glib sometimes when I say these sort of things, but it is possible to perform certain academic tasks like essays or write exams or do assignments or quizzes, and the extent to which the student understands or even has learned anything after completing that work is negligible or entirely incidental. That it is possible to get through things. So I guess I sort of go back to one of the things that has been said over and over again, which is if the piece of work does require something above that, if it requires a certain amount of engagement, if it requires an interrogation or investigation of what is real for the student or what it is they're trying to say or what it is they're trying to engage with, they're going to be less likely to seek shortcuts because those shortcuts are not going to help them with that. They're not going to assist. So I don't know if that addresses the sort of angle that you were interested in, Brian, or if it addresses the question. But that's just something that I've seen. It's something that I've seen over and over and over again.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. Sarah, did you want to say something about that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, what comes to mind from the broader discussion is really kind of emphasizing that assessments need to be fit for purpose, right? And that starts with what's the goal of the course? And then, unpacking those learning objectives, what at the end of this course students will, right? We all have those learning objectives in our course, and then using the goal of the course, the learning objectives as a driver for designing our assessments. So if one of the outcomes of the course is not for students to produce writing, why are we giving them assignments that involve writing? And it's a legitimate question. I'm not trying to be sarcastic there, right? And if one of the goals of the course is not to produce writing, then what other assignments can we design and give that will help students show their learning if the purpose of the assignment is to have students demonstrate what they've learned in the class? That's a big piece we're talking about now. And is it through some other means, right? Through storytelling, podcasting, demonstrations, problem-based learning, where students can show what they've learned. Because if the assignment can be outsourced to a person, to a service, to a technology, and students are under this extreme pressure, and what matters then is the transaction. I submit an essay, you give me a grade, then learning is taken out of that equation. It's important that learning be kept as the central part of that equation.
Yeah, and as someone who's helped a lot of students write over the years, we never write alone. we're always writing with someone, whether it's a tutor, an instructor, or a text that we're writing from. So this idea of the lone author, it's not true. It's never been true. To do some, let's change now to some prognostication, some looking into the future. I want to ask Christiane, one of the questions we got, where do you think we will be in 18 months from now, considering where we were in November to where we are now?
I love predicting the future because we're so terrible at it. We're so bad. I'm going to give you a flying car. It's a Model T Ford with wings that flies. No, 18 months is actually close enough. GPT-5 is probably going to come out by the end of the year. Everything we believe GPT-4 can't do will have to be reassessed at this point. There are fields of computer science such as machine reasoning, which is super powerful, that actually does work with facts and rigid first order logic that has not been connected yet to language model. That stuff necessarily is going to be connected fairly quickly. I think something to keep an eye on, and that is the possible flying car here. As I've mentioned, these language models are just converting tokens into tokens, words into pixels, or words into words. There is a new transformer model that looks at actions. So from text to action. So instead of generating text, it's I think the system's called Act 1, but there's a fair chance that an action transformer with from a different group or a different company will come out. Instead of generating a text in terms of keystrokes and characters and words and sentences, we'll generate mouse movement, mouse clicks, keyboard strokes, and essentially operate a computer. And the use case right now is fairly simple. Perform a task as part of a, I think it's a Chrome plugin, and then it operates the browser to navigate through pages and get the piece of text. Now imagine having an action transformer that does not work within the browser, but work within the system or an operating system, and you have a computer that all of a sudden is going to perform tasks that can be arbitrarily complex depending on the software that it's installed on. I think that this is possibly, in my opinion, not just a flying car, but the disruption that is actually going to be displacing text generation. But we have a recording of that, right? So in 18 months, I'd like someone to send me a link to this so I can have a good laugh.
Yeah, I think there's that Arthur C. Clarke. He talks about in 1964. If somebody could actually tell you about the future, you would think they're, not sane. What do you think about that question, Sarah? About where we'll be in 18 months from your perspective, and in the work that you're doing?
Well, I put a link to a YouTube video in the chat that I think points to where we might be, and it's a video from Microsoft demoing a Copilot, which is their AI, one of their AI tools, and it talks about the way in which it will manage our email for us, paraphrase our emails, create our task list from our emails. The technology has already been built, they demo it, and that it's likely to become integrated into Microsoft Office within the next 12 to 24 months. So if I had a crystal ball, I think it's reasonable to anticipate that we can expect that AI will become integrated into everyday technologies that we use, Microsoft Office, Google Suite, etc., such that we won't be able to turn it off. So yeah, that will be interesting times, as they say. And as somebody had put in the chat earlier, privacy concerns may be a whole different conversation that we're having at that time.
And how will this affect, looking ahead, Aisha, how will this affect language teaching, do you think? Thinking about how these are all going to be, translation. I know Sarah's talking about, how language will become less important over time in terms of looking at what language is used and so on. I can see that in the future for sure. What does that look like to you in your scholarship and teaching?
So I would approach it from just looking at previous examples of how new changes have impacted language learning in the past. So one of the things is the use of dictionaries. It's so embraced now, it's become a part of how we do language learning, how we teach language learning. It has been incorporated in it. And similarly, I feel like we're moving towards the use of certain elements in translators that way. So I view from now to 18 months, we have a runway where we're going to be looking at our policies, our guidelines, our pedagogy, and making adjustments accordingly. I think it's just opened up, it's kind of spiced up language teaching a little bit for us as well. So looking at how we use these technologies to enable our learners to learn more efficiently and learn and be more engaged in the learning process as well. I don't see, especially software like ChatGPT, I don't see them as hindering language education, because what's the fun of language learning if you're not engaging in the process of producing the language yourself? So I feel like the idea of outcomes, the idea of the purposeful teaching is going to become more prevalent in our discussions with our students and how we use these softwares.
Yeah, that's a really good point, actually. I remember when handheld translators were illegal to have in school, and now, of course, everyone has one in their hand. Bob, what are you looking at in terms of where you're sitting in terms of down the road?
Well, interestingly, there's a question in the Q&A that speaks to this, and I've heard a number of people say this in some meetings that I've attended and some other forums that I've attended, which is that we're probably going to have to get to a point in certain circumstances and in certain contexts where in the investigation or evaluation of a piece of work or something that a student has done, there's going to have to be a almost oral examination component to it, where we are seeking some sort of proof from the individual that they have retained some sort of understanding or knowledge that proves that they did the thing, that they engaged with it. I mean, I've had difficult feelings about that going back as far as I can remember, because the fact is people don't always retain knowledge even when they have meaningfully engaged with a piece of work, depending on what the stakes are for them. It is largely an unreliable investigative tool, depending on how much time has passed. It can amount to a sort of self-incrimination exercise for someone. And personally, I think that the remedy for that is to incorporate that sort of oral examination type exercise into the evaluation of the piece of work itself from the beginning, and that students need to have expectations and be told that there's going to be a moment where you're going to be held to account in real time. I mean, I did some of my undergraduate education in music, and there was performance. There were performance components. There were keyboard skills performance. There was, sort of oral perception components that were done in real time, where you needed to be able to demonstrate that you had done the work to be able to play the thing, or you knew the chords, or you could sing the notes and recognize the things. And there were no cheats to it. You had to do it in real time. That's all well and good to say, but our education models have evolved to the point where it's becoming less and less practical and more unwieldy to consider the idea that we will be able to work those things into our evaluations, because the numbers are massive. Our admissions are huge. Our classes are enormous. Just the thought of doing that pivot is going to be difficult. But I do see that as being something that's going to be explored and talked about and debated over the next little while. And I anticipate that there will likely be some changes made to some curricula, some course syllabi, some programs that try to work those things in to make sure that there are those touchstones. That's something I'm already seeing develop.
Yeah, I think Christiane pointed that out earlier. It's already happening.
Yeah.
And there was an article in Higher Education talking about, I think I shared this with you earlier, Bob, talking about how, for the past 20 years, we really haven't known who's writing essays. And
Yeah.
the author called ChatGPT the big rain that's come through the leak in the ceiling. And Sean pointed out in the chat, he said, ironically, the AI will mark the AI. And we already have AI tools that are, GPT-0, for example, that is tracking down people using GPT. So yeah, it's going to be very interesting in the near future.
I know we're getting very tight on time. There's one thing I just wanted to add, which weighs very heavily on my mind, and I think about all the time. I am a former Marshall McLuhan enthusiast and a student of that sort of school of thought. And the one question that I don't hear a lot of people asking, I hear people asking, how is this technology going to change the way we deliver courses, the way that we evaluate, the way that we detect AI? I'm hearing all of this being talked about. One thing I'm not hearing being discussed very much is, how will these things change the way we think, the way we approach exercises, the way we approach our work? And I've used this, Sarah, I know, has heard me use this example. I don't think it's an ethical thing. If tomorrow, Canada Revenue Agency said, we require every single citizen to do their own taxes. Every single citizen has to do their own taxes because we need you to understand it. There are some people who are rule followers who will figure out a way to do it. There are other people who won't want to do it themselves, but they will, they're not going to, they'll be enthusiastic about it. Maybe there's a number of people, but there are some folks who will just say, well, this doesn't matter enough to me, and I'm not interested in this, and I don't have the acumen for it. So I'm sorry, I have no other choice than to find someone else to do it. And, as the tools get better and the exercises get stronger and the technology gets better, the more likely we are to have people who will just lose the ability altogether to be able to engage in that kind of inquiry and that kind of work. We're still going to need people in law school who are going to be able to write. And if you don't learn how to write in undergrad or in high school, international baccalaureate programs have already said that they will allow the use of these models as long as they're cited.
Right.
So these things are happening but it's going to change the way people think about this stuff. And that's a much deeper dive as far as I'm concerned, in terms of thinking about how it's going to change all of this stuff. The people are going to show up changed, whether we change the way we do things or not. So we're going to have to be prepared for that.
Yeah. And thanks very much, Bob. And we don't want to end on talk about taxes, but there we are.
Sure. Well, it's the right time of year.
I appreciate that. And we're not sponsored by H&R Block, by the way. Thank you so much to our panelists, to Sarah Eaton, to Christiane Blouin, to Bob Mann, and to Aisha Mustak for bringing their knowledge and expertise here. Thank you all for joining us. As we've mentioned, the recording will be there, as well as the chat will be there as well. And thank you very much again to Jennifer McDonald. I hope you all have a good day. There's a lot of more questions and answers here, but hopefully this panel has left you with something to think about and to ponder going forward. So thank you very much, and have a good afternoon.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Goodbye.